All right, listen up, you little goblins. You ever hear a story so messed up it makes you clench places you didn't even know could clench? Well, buckle up, Buttercup, because this one's a real ass clencher. We're talking creepy old apartments, a haunted stairwell, and a girl named Sarah who made the kind of life choices that scream, "I want to be a ghost real bad." Now, I know horror movies taught us that if you hear spooky sobbing in the dark, you run the other way. But no, Sarah just had to investigate. And guess what? Things went full nightmare fuel. So grab your snacks, dim the lights, and prepare for a story that'll make you rethink every late-night bathroom trip. This is Down She Goes, and trust me, she goes down hard. When a girl named Sarah was 16, her family moved into a crumbling old apartment building on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where the wallpaper peeled like a bad sunburn, and the staircases groaned like an old man getting out of bed. The building had once been fancy. Back in the 1920s, it was a hotel for rich folks who probably did cocaine off every surface. But now, now it was home to retirees and folks hanging on by a thread. There was an elevator, but Sarah's mom always told her not to use it. And you know how teenagers are. Tell them not to do something and that's basically a dare. But Sarah actually liked the stairs. The staircase wound down the center of the building, a spiraling concrete death trap with rusted metal railings. It was dimly lit, and her footsteps would echo all the way down, sometimes bouncing back in a way that made it sound like someone else was following. It all started a couple of weeks after they moved in. Sarah was coming home from a friend's house in the early evening. The hallway lights had that sickly yellow glow, casting long shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking. She slipped through the stairwell door, and as she began her descent, she heard it. Soft at first, almost a whisper. Crying. Not your typical, "I lost my puppy" kind of crying. This was that deep, gut-wrenching sob that makes your skin crawl. "Hello," she called out, her voice bouncing off the walls. The crying stopped immediately, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like a boulder on her chest. Her skin prickled, and every horror movie she'd ever seen screamed, "Get out." But nope, Sarah kept going. You know, as if the killer would politely wait until she got to the bottom. She reached the third-floor landing and hesitated. The crying started again, louder now. It was a woman's voice, broken and wet, like someone was crying through a throat full of sludge. It was coming from below. She leaned over the railing, peering down into the shadowy spiral of the stairwell. The dim lights only reached so far, and the lower levels were just a black hole of nope. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice wavering. There was no response, just the continued sobbing. She swallowed hard and took another step down. Her sneakers scuffed against the concrete, the sound too loud, too sharp. She moved slowly, her pulse thumping in her ears, each step dragging her closer to whatever nightmare waited below. When she reached the second floor, she froze. The air had changed. It was colder, damp. Her breath fogged in front of her, and the smell hit her sharp and metallic like rust and something worse. The crying had stopped again. The silence stretched too tight, and she realized that the shadows on the walls weren't just shadows. They were moving. Yeah, this is the part where a smart person would leave, right? But not Sarah. She tightened her grip on the railing and moved forward like she was the final girl in a horror movie. From below, a soft, wet scraping sound echoed up, like something being dragged. Her body was on autopilot, moving even though every nerve was screaming to get out of there. The door to the basement was open just a crack. Beyond it was nothing but darkness. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached out to push it open. The scraping sound continued, rhythmic and disturbingly human. Her fingers brushed the door, and it swung open wider with a low creak. The light from the stairwell barely penetrated the basement, but she could make out shapes, old boxes, a mop leaning against the wall, and something else. It was a figure, crumpled on the ground. She squinted, and as her eyes adjusted, she realized it was a woman. She was on her hands and knees, her back to Sarah, crawling slowly across the damp concrete floor. "Mom?" Sarah asked, her voice thin and small. The woman didn't respond. Sarah took a step closer, her foot splashing in a shallow puddle. The sound seemed to get the woman's attention. She stopped moving, her body going completely still. Sarah's mouth went dry as she stared, waiting for the woman to say something, to turn and look at her. The woman moved slowly, her head turning with a jerky, unnatural motion. Her hair hung over her face, wet and stringy, and her limbs were bent at odd angles. She twisted until she was facing Sarah, her mouth hanging open, eyes wide and unblinking. Sarah couldn't see her face clearly, but the way she moved made her skin crawl. The silence was unbearable. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The woman's body began to shift, her limbs cracking and popping as she rose to her feet. Her head lolled to the side, and Sarah realized she was barefoot, her skin pale and mottled with dark patches. Sarah turned and ran, her sneakers slipping on the wet floor. The door to the stairwell seemed miles away, and every step felt like she was wading through quicksand. Behind her, the gurgling grew louder, wet and choking. She reached the door and slammed into it, her shoulder throbbing as she shoved it open. She stumbled into the stairwell, the door swinging shut behind her with a hollow clang. She didn't stop running until she was back in her apartment, the door locked and bolted behind her. Her mom asked what was wrong, but Sarah couldn't find the words to explain. She just sat on the couch, staring at the floor, her mind replaying the image of that woman's twisted body and the wet sounds of her breathing. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she heard it again. The soft, broken sobbing. It echoed up through the floor, vibrating through the walls. She covered her ears, but it didn't stop. It never stopped. The next morning, Sarah woke up with dark circles under her eyes and a knot in her stomach. She hadn't slept much, the sound of that sobbing echoing in her mind long after it had stopped. Her mum gave her a worried look over breakfast, but Sarah just mumbled something about bad dreams and skipped eating. She couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in the basement was still there, waiting. Days passed, and the crying continued. Sometimes it was soft and distant, other times it was right beneath her feet, as if the woman was clawing through the floorboards. Sarah avoided the stairwell, taking the creaky old elevator despite her mum's warnings. But even in the elevator, she felt like she was being watched, the small window in the door showing nothing but shadows that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. Then, one rainy afternoon, the elevator broke down between floors. Sarah's heart pounded as the lights flickered. She was trapped. She pressed the emergency button, but all she got was a static-filled buzz. Her phone had no signal. The air felt heavy, and with every breath it seemed to get thicker, pressing down on her chest. And then, the sobbing started again. This time it was right outside the elevator door. Sarah pressed herself against the back wall, her body trembling. Through the tiny window, she could see the dim light of the hallway, but nothing else. The crying grew louder, turning into a wail. The metal door creaked, as if something was pressing against it from the outside. The voice was broken, wet, the same as before. Sarah's mind raced. Was it a real person, or was it the same thing from the basement? Her instincts screamed to stay still, but her body moved on its own. She reached out, her hand shaking as she touched the cold metal handle of the door. The door slid open just a crack, and the sobbing stopped. Silence filled the small space, heavy and suffocating. Sarah squinted through the gap, her breath fogging the glass. At first, she saw nothing but the empty hallway, dim and damp. Then slowly, a figure moved into view. It was the woman. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her wet hair hanging over her face. She moved in quick, jerky bursts, her limbs bending in ways that made Sarah's stomach turn. The woman's face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and unblinking, black pits of nothingness.
Come down!
The woman hissed, her voice a mix of water and rot. Her pale lips split into a grin, revealing blackened gums and teeth that seemed too sharp. Sarah screamed and pulled the door shut, slamming her body against it. The elevator shuddered, and with a lurch it started moving again. The woman's face vanished, but Sarah could still hear the soft thud of her head hitting the door, again and again, all the way down. When the elevator finally opened at the lobby, Sarah ran out, gasping for air. She didn't stop until she was outside, the rain soaking through her clothes. She looked back at the building, half expecting to see the woman staring at her from one of the windows. But all she saw was the empty darkness. Her mum didn't believe her. Nobody did. Sarah stopped going to school, stopped leaving the apartment. She sat in her room, headphones on, trying to drown out the sound of the sobbing that never stopped. She barely slept, and when she did, she dreamed of the basement, of wet, cold hands dragging her down into the dark. One night, the sobbing got louder. It was in the hallway just outside her door. Sarah sat up, her body stiff with fear. The door handle rattled, slowly at first, then harder. She held her breath, her fingers digging into the mattress. The door creaked open just an inch, and the sobbing stopped. Sarah. The voice was a whisper, soft and broken. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The door swung open wider, and there she was. The woman, standing in the doorway, her twisted limbs casting long, crooked shadows on the wall. The woman took a step forward, her bare feet making wet, slapping sounds on the wooden floor. Sarah's body finally reacted, and she scrambled off the bed, backing up until she hit the wall. Her fingers found the edge of her nightstand, and she grabbed the lamp, holding it out like a weapon. "Stay away," she screamed, her voice hoarse. The woman didn't stop. She moved closer, her head lolling from side to side. Sarah swung the lamp, and it shattered against the woman's head. Shards of glass flew, but the woman didn't react. Instead, she leaned forward, her cold, damp breath washing over Sarah's face. "Down! You... go!" The woman's hands shot out, gripping Sarah's wrists. Her skin was slimy, cold as death. Sarah's legs buckled, and suddenly the floor was gone. She was falling, darkness swallowing her whole. The last thing she heard was the woman's broken laughter echoing through the black. Sarah's body was found at the bottom of the stairwell, twisted and broken, just like the woman she had seen. The police called it an accident, a slip, a fall. But some say you can still hear her, sobbing in the stairwell, calling for help. And if you listen too closely, you might just end up...